Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our latest Free Press Book Club meeting for Matthew Tétreault's novel, Hold Your Tongue. Thank you all so much for joining us. We'll kick things off with a quick round of introductions. My name is Nadya Pankiw, and I am your book club administrator. We have Free Press columnist Rebecca Chambers joining us as host. We have Adam Araujo from McNally Robinson and author Matthew Tétreault. This stream is coming to you from Winnipeg, which is Treaty 1 land and the original territories of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, Lakota, Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Red River Métis. In a moment here, I'll pass it off to Adam for an introduction, and then Matthew will take it away with a reading, followed by our Q&A. If you have any questions, there is a live chat box to the bottom right of the video, and we will get to those questions when we can. After our discussion today, I will introduce our next pick. And with that, it's over to you, Adam.
Oh, thank you, Nadya. Here's the book for tonight, Hold Your Tongue by Matthew Tétreault. A quick synopsis of the book. Upon learning his great-uncle Alfred has suffered a stroke, Richard sets out for St. Anne in southeastern Manitoba to find his father and tell him the news. Waylaid by memories of his stalled romance, tales of run-ins with local Mennonites, his job working a honey wagon, and struck by visions of Métis history and secrets of his family's past, Richard confronts his desires to leave town, even as he learns to embrace his heritage. Evoking an oral storytelling epic that weaves together one family's complex history, Hold Your Tongue asks what it means to be Métis and Francophone. Recalling the work of Katerina Vermette and Joshua Whitehead, Matthew Tétreault's debut novel shines with a poignant but playful character-driven meditation on the struggles of holding on to la langue, and marks the emergence of an important new voice. Hold Your Tongue is the 60th entry in the Nunatak first fiction series, which has also included debut novels by Tiana Bischoff, Hiromi Goto, Suzette Mayer, and Thomas Warden. Matthew Tétreault is Métis and French-Canadian from St. Anne, Manitoba. He's the author of What Happened on the Blood Vein from Pemmican Publications, a dark and humorous collection of interrelated short stories set in southeast Manitoba. Matt holds a PhD in Métis literature and literary history from the University of Alberta, and he received a Governor General's Gold Medal for academic excellence. His dissertation traces the literary history of the Red River Métis. In between academic and creative writing projects, Matt plays guitar, video games, and poker for pocket change. He recently moonlighted as the farm boss on his in-laws' ranch in St. Ambroise, where he, his wife, daughter, and his old cat, Major Tom, landed upon their return to Manitoba. Hold Your Tongue is his first novel, and he lives in Winnipeg. On a brief personal note, Matt and I have been friends for over 20 years, former roommates on the 5th floor of an apartment block on Pabranche Boulevard, and competitors in an informal Settlers of Catan League, among other nerdy pursuits. My time living with Matt and Lisa and working at a call center that was suspiciously similar to the one where Monique works in the novel, were the foundation of this Anglo's engagement with the Franco-Manitoban community and an education in a Métis history and legacy that had essentially been omitted from my schooling. In reading Hold Your Tongue, I could see Matt's desire to both defend and celebrate a Métis heritage on every page, though I'm sure you don't have to be friends with him to pick up on this. C'est une œuvre de vraie fierté, a truly proud work, and it's my great pleasure to be part of this discussion tonight.
Wow, thank you. Thanks, Adam. That means a lot. Yes, I'll keep the reading really brief. I want to get into the Q&A. I'm excited to just talk about what I've been working on. The novel took 7 years maybe to write, and so, there's been a lot of kind of thought into it, and so I'm excited to talk about it. But I figured I'd start off by reading a section from chapter number 2, when Alfred fell out of the tree. So that's if anyone wants to follow along, I'll be starting on page 14, about a third of the way down. Alfred had hurt his back sometime before I was born. Story was he had fallen out of a tree. He had been out hunting, sitting in a tree stand, when the weather turned sour and dumped a layer of wet snow on the land. He kept a flask with him because you never know, and so this time, to keep warm, he sipped at his whiskey. There was a buck behind his cabin that had caught his eye, so he decided to wait for it to come around. He sipped his drink while the snow grew heavier and began to pile up in the branches and blanket the ground. Shivering, Alfred shook the snow off his coat. He wiped his gun stock and took another sip of whiskey. The snow turned to rain and then to ice when it landed and coated the trees and the branches and the tips of Alfred's boots. Finally, figuring the buck had bedded down somewhere, Alfred decided to head home. But as he began to descend, his boot slipped on a steel rung and he tumbled backwards into a pile of deadfall. Deux pieds à gauche puis une branche m'aurait crevé le cœur, Alfred had later said. With the wind knocked out of him, he lay there for a time and watched the snow and the rain and the ice ricochet through the branches above. When he finally tried to stand, a sharp pain fired in his back and down his legs. He collapsed into the wet muck of leaves, snow, and mud. Groaning, he rolled onto his stomach and began to crawl. Before long, he realized he didn't know where he was going. He had never seen things from the perspective of a rabbit before, never mind all the wet snow whirling through the air. Thinking back on it, Alfred probably had a concussion too. Still, he pressed on and dragged himself toward what he thought was home. Of course, the first time Alfred told the story, there was no flask. He said a squirrel had climbed up his rifle barrel and tickled his nose, and as he went to knock it away, he fell out of the tree. Second time, he sneezed and fell out. The reason changed every time he told the story, but always there was singing. Dragging himself forward through the thick underbrush, he grew tired, but knew that to rest would bring death. To keep himself awake, keep himself going, he began to sing. At first, he sang anything that popped into his head, tattered bits of old songs and lyrics without melody. He bellowed it out. C'est au champ de bataille, j'ai fait crier ma douleur, où tout d'un coup se passe, ça fait frémir les cœurs. His toes twitched and the fiddle itch propelled him forward. Oh, je pris mon canif, je le trempais dans mon sang. When we were younger, with my sister Monique and me seated at his feet, Alfred would throw himself to the ground and reenact the scene. We would crawl together through the living room, around the old coffee table, between the sofa and the wall, under the old stuffed deer head, and into the kitchen, around the chairs and under the table, singing loudly and off-key as we went. C'est au champ de bataille. The story grew taller with every telling. Alfred even once boasted of killing the very buck he'd been hunting, coming across it by chance as it lay sheltered under the boughs of a pine tree. He shot it from his stomach, crawled up to the body, split open its belly with his hunting knife, and huddled up against it so that its steaming heat could keep him warm while he regained his strength. Juste comme Luke and Han avec le tauntaun, I said. Monique rolled her eyes. Alfred blinked and stared at me. Qu'est-ce que tu racontes? A few times, Alfred tried to show us where it happened, retracing his steps through the woods. But such time had passed that the old trails were overgrown. New trees had replaced the old ones, and Alfred led us in circles before we retreated to his cabin. Monique later said it had just been an excuse to get us out of the house and teach us some things about plants. I couldn't help but wonder, though, what had happened to the tree stand? Was there still an empty chair in the canopy somewhere? Though the story changed with every telling, there was always a few constants. The tree, the fall, the singing, and ma mère. The details varied, how and when it happened, or what song he sang, but it was always ma mère that found Alfred frostbitten and delirious, crawling at the edge of her yard. It was ma mère who brought him inside to warm him up, to nurse him back to health. Une ange, Alfred said. Elle m'a sauvé la vie. His eyes moist and his dark, weathered face growing soft, he would stare off into the recesses of an old memory, and we knew then that the story was done. Le vieux pète est plein de merde, ma mère had once said. Il aurait fait n'importe quoi pour venir prendre un coup. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt. That's really kind of exciting to hear it in your own voice. I know we all read with our own characters in mind, and it feels even more familiar somehow coming straight from you. For those of you out on the internet, whom I haven't had the pleasure yet of meeting, my name is Rebecca Chambers. I'm a columnist with the Free Press, and I'm delighted to be asked to host tonight. I thoroughly enjoyed this book. I read it really for pleasure, and then talked about it so much that our associate editor was like, how about you host the book club on this? Because you seem to really like it. So thanks very much for this wonderful work. We have a few questions that have been sent in advance, and I think maybe just to bridge, I do see one in the chat here about readers who don't speak French. Now, I'm Red River Métis also, but I am Anglo Métis, and my homeland is up around St. Andrews. I found yet the language to be and I'll maybe ask you more in detail about this later, but as an Anglo, felt it used maybe intentionally and maybe not as a mechanism to help me recognize if I was an insider or an outsider in certain times throughout the novel. So it was almost like being at a friend's house when they speak a different language, and you're still there and you're still appreciated and you can still kind of know what's going on, but you don't pick up all of the cues. And perhaps intentional that you're tossing out some of these things for folks who are more part of that inner circle. But even through all the layers of language, I mean, having a couple of the wives named after dairy companies and stuff, there's this good insider outsider play with language. So that was my feelings as Anglo reader. I have heard lots back mostly about language. Language seems to be the first thing people want to talk about when they want to talk about this book. So one of the first questions we received over email also has to do with this. And this reader said they enjoyed the book, learned a lot about Métis culture and history. Thank you, Matthew. I would have found it easier to read if there had been a glossary for the Michif words and phrases. And was a glossary something you considered ever in the editing process?
It was not. I specifically set out to challenge, I guess, the way that Métis stories are told, primarily now in Western Canada, which is primarily from an Anglophone perspective. And so I wanted to challenge that as much as possible. I still wanted to make it accessible and legible. And so I do provide, I guess, a lot of the translation is provided through the context of the scene. Sometimes the characters will sort of, if it's in conversation, they might repeat kind of what they're saying. And so you can get a sense as to what's going on. But it was very much an effort to challenge the presence of, really Anglo-dominant narratives, and then invite, Anglophiles, Anglophones to try to kind of meet me halfway in a sense, to try to make that effort to meet the language, part of, it's like a very small part of it, part of like language revitalization is immersing yourself in that other language. And so if there's a glossary and you're constantly flipping to the back or wherever it is, and even a footnote, like it breaks that immersion. And so the idea of breaking that immersion, I didn't want to do that. I wanted to make it everything self-contained within the narrative itself. So that was something I was set pretty firmly early on, even as I was writing the first few drafts of the novel, that sort of sense of not wanting to provide a glossary.
And what have you heard from other Anglo readers? What has been the feedback? Just to answer that question in the chat, I guess that this other reader also.
I mean, the ones who've given me feedback have loved it. If someone has not loved it and, they met a wall and they stopped reading it, they haven't let me know yet. So what I've heard so far has been really positive. Yeah, so I'm not sure if people are encountering those challenges. I'm hoping that people are making the effort to to work through those challenges and meet me halfway. Yeah.
Thank you. Nadya, I think you're in charge of the chat questions. So if it's all right, I'm going to move on to the other one that was submitted by email.
Yes, yeah, keep going and we'll get to the chat questions when we can. And a reminder to our readers that are here with us as this meeting is happening or unfolding live. If you do have questions for us, you can always email them in advance to our book club at winnipegfreepress.com, and that way we can be sure that we can get to those first. So go over to you, Rebecca.
Thanks. I can tell from the questions that people were really immersed and feeling really present in what was happening and wanting to know, did this really happen? Where is the context for this within this place where we live, where we share? So this question says, in chapter 19, Emile tells Richard about the English inspectors coming into classes searching out French books and the nuns hiding them away. I was born in 1950. I recall my mom and dad telling me that this happened in about their day, early 1900s. I'm assuming that Emile is in his 50s at the time of the book. I went to school in St. Boniface in the 50s and 60s, and French was taught, and there were French classes. Did the practice of English inspectors continue in country schools later? I so enjoyed this book. I have seen so many friends and places described on its pages. Thank you.
Yeah, so that's one of the example. Like, I have my parents, they're in their early 70s now, and like they have stories of that happening. So like I think my dad went to school in Richer, Richer, and I think my mom went to school in Haywood or like St. Claude area of Manitoba. So like more like two rural kind of spaces. So I'm not sure if there was a difference in terms of like urban and rural situations for these inspectors, but you know, they would have been going to school in like the late 50s, I guess, in like for their primary school education, and they had stories of that happening to them. And then these stories are just like they float around like the Francophone community as well, because it's, you know, one of the struggles, I guess, that, you know, the Francophone community has endured in like the 20th century in Manitoba. And so it's something that, you know, whether or not it makes absolute sense timeline wise, I felt it was still important to show in the novel. So like the history, some of it is like, you know, it's not a history book. It's it's very thematic and evocative of like broader narratives. And so that's one where there's definitely an element of truth of it. Whether or not in, say, 1964 it was still actually ongoing is another question. And then I would also flip it around to the sense that, you know, from the perspective of children who were experiencing this at that time, just the presence of an Anglophone walking in and like being very official would have been scary as well, potentially, right? And so they, whether or not they had the authority to, like, you know, look at textbooks and not, you know, what they probably wouldn't have known at that point, right? And so it's like the evocation, like the how it evokes that sense of fear and oppression and linguistic assimilation and all that. So I think it was important to just bring that sense forward in the novel.
Follow up to that one, congratulations on your first novel. It's great, and our parts of it are autobiographical.
There are a few small parts that are, you know, I draw on my own experiences working on a septic truck for the novel. But otherwise, a lot of it is, you know, I wanted to create a sense of place and evoke a sense of place. So there's a lot of like personal experience that goes into that. But narratively, it's not my experience. I mean, Richard is a fictional character. You know, there might be elements of him that, you know, Adam or other friends might recognize as something that might resonate with my own experiences, but Richard is very much like a fictional character. Yeah, and like so I tried, that was part of the revision process, was filtering out my own biographical sort of stuff out of the novel and like really creating a fiction, right? So as you know, for early versions of the draft or early versions of the novel probably started off a little bit more autobiographical, autofiction kind of stuff. And I found that constraining. So I wanted to remove that and then just really to be able to imagine the story and then make it representative of an area, but then also being able to like broadly link it to these other larger stories and histories and narratives. So
thank you. Yeah, I was terribly taken with how immersive it was myself, how I felt it was quite cinematic. So I'm kind of happy to find that other readers feel so immersed in your writing. Thank you. I'm going to hand it over now to Adam for the next chunk of questions that we have here.
Yes, since you bring up the very unique septic job, we had not one but two questions surrounding the Honey Wagon. The first one is Monsieur Tétreault describes draining a septic tank on page 56 to 57. Has Monsieur Tétreault done this job? Is the author's description of cleaning septic tanks from experience either firsthand or as an observer, or simply well-described fiction? The next question was simply, what is your experience with the Honey Wagon? I think we need some dirty details here from your Honey Wagon experience.
Sure. I mean, so my dad owned a septic truck when we were living in the town in St. Anne, in St. Anne. So I would have been, I don't remember, like 12, 13 years old. And he would pay me $3 a tank to come help him. And so it was a way for me to make a little bit of money. And so I went out on like a number of jobs with him, and we would, lift the tank, like lift the lid off the tank, and like, drag the hoses out, hook them up, fill the Honey Wagon, fill the septic truck to its limit, and then bring it over to the lagoon and drain it and rinse and repeat, doing that sort of thing. I still think to this day, my sense of smell is affected by those experiences. I don't smell things that smell very good, like easily, but things that stink, I can detect them like really. So I've got a nose for the job, I guess, which is unfortunate. But yeah, so like it's definitely from firsthand experience. That's small town it's a very rural thing. There's generally no sewers in the country. Septic tanks, septic fields, that kind of stuff. And then the other element is I wanted to, play that up a little bit as well. And so I think there was one line I describe it as like the sound of like a chorus of children sucking on Slurpees or something, right? Like that sound. Just that juxtaposition of food and feces is like really off-putting. So I just wanted to play it up. And then my editor noted, as we were working on the novel, that I was contributing to the scatological canon of CanLit by including all of this stuff. And so I was like, that's a contribution. Good.
Well, that'll be another very niche series from some small press, no doubt. You also had an early short story surrounding a Honey Wagon. Like, when I think about that, is that, what's the importance of that story with kind of where you are now with your literature? Like, when did you start writing like in this way and more autobiographical or more about this kind of, because I mean, bad poetry aside and things like that, it's
I think it was probably when I went back to university. So when I first went back to the University of Winnipeg, and decided to take creative writing, right, at the University of Winnipeg, trying to figure out what I was going to be writing about. You're just forced to produce. You're forced to like write short stories or poetry or whatever it is that you're wanting to do. You're forced to write and produce it and bring it to class and workshop it and hand it in, all that kind of stuff, right? And so I had taken, so before going back to school, I had taken a very long time to produce anything. And so I felt that pressure, forced me to like, okay, well, what am I going to write about? And then it just felt natural to start writing about what I knew, which was, growing up in the country, St. Anne. And so, Honey Wagon made an appearance in an early story. That writing then at that point wasn't as polished, and I wasn't thinking as big like thematically as well. It was just very much like that sort of mimetic sort of fiction where you're just writing about experiences and like you're moving forward through those experiences. But I was also trying to work out how to capture the sense of an area in that early fiction, so that it gave me a lot of practice that I could transfer over to this novel. Is how to start really getting a sense of an area.
Great. To segue from talking about the larger thematic realities of your writing now. The final question we have is, Alfred tells a story of headstones removed from St. Bede Cathedral cemetery so earth could be scraped off to shore up the dike, page 115 to 116. After the 1950 flood, headstones were replaced on memory because there weren't any plans. Is this fact or fiction? Is the question.
Yeah, it's fact as far as I know. I've heard the story told. I think I first heard it from a historian. I think it was Philip Mayotte, who was the ex um, president, maybe, of the St. Boniface Museum. So like I remember hearing that story from him at one point, and I've heard it a few other places, and so. Like, I'm not sure if I've ever seen that story written down anywhere, but it's something that I'd heard, right? And so, as far as I know, it's fiction. It's oral history that's been kind of passed along. So, kind of like the story itself, it's not been written down. It's kept alive by memory. And so the same thing with like that happens in the story. So, as far as I know, it is true. Yeah.
Yeah, for me, that line read exactly like you're saying. The focus on oral history is that's the story you heard. That's the story you know. That's what it is. The headstones being replaced and being like, well, that's either that person's grave or that person's grave, but like let's just say that's whose it is and move forward. And I thought that was it just tied it together so well. There's a few other passages that really bring that reality of what you're doing in the novel of just saying like this is the story one way, this is how it is maybe other ways, but like that's what's important is that the story exists regardless of
Yeah.
of how it continues on, as long as it continues.
Yeah, absolutely. And like those like it ties into like larger storytelling structures, I guess, that I'm trying to play with right throughout the whole novel. So I mean, like the example that I read today, like it kind of leads into that, right? So Alfred tells the story one way, but then by the end of like 2 pages, there's like 4 versions, 5 versions, right? You're aware that there's many different versions of it. And then as you know, I guess there's no spoilers, right? In this discussion. So
just pause
I'm so
now
I'm
if
so
you
used
are
to talking
watching the
with people
stream
who haven't
and
read it yet that's like I'm not trying to spoil everything. But by the end, we get to like, a truer version as well, where it's like that story is actually his brother that tried to kill him right in the tree. And so it's like that the way that I learned from doing an old history project at the University of Winnipeg, talking to people in St. Anne, the way that stories are told, and you're given stories bit by bit, piece by piece, over time, whether or not that's part of storytelling survival strategies throughout the 20th century because of things like the forgotten years, le grand silence, linguistic assimilation, all these kinds of things. Perhaps it impacts the structure of storytelling. But anyways, stories are given bit by bit, and it's a bit of a responsibility of the listener or the reader or whoever's receiving the story to like gather the pieces and put them back together into a narrative whole, right? And so that's a little bit of what's happening, or what I hope is happening in the novel itself for readers as well. If they're given the pieces bit by bit across the novel, and then they're putting it together as they're going along. I hope that's how it's working.
That part to me felt really familiar. That felt like intergenerational conversations when I've been growing up. And my interpretation of it is that people are always trying to protect something. Well, there's only so much they can give, but those of us in the younger generations trying to piece something together, it can get frustrating and confusing, and kind of that ephemeral soup that starts to churn that you construct so well throughout the story, where I felt less like a reader and more like a participant. I felt very much part of what was happening. And I think the language and the returning to stories and piecing things together made it kind of participatory. There was a lot to draw the reader along as we went.
Out. So that was one of the things I was unsure of going into it. Like so when I wrote the first draft, it was very linear, and I was not happy with that draft of it. And I didn't have enough knowledge or experience to be able to tell the story how I wanted to tell it, and like really make storytelling a focal, like a crux of the whole thing, right? Um, which is why I did that PhD, which is why I went and like, I went and got the knowledge I needed by reading as much Métis writing as possible and getting that sense and being like, oh, okay, that's how you do it in writing. Because I mean, there's like, you can sit around the kitchen table and listen to people, which is a fantastic way. But then how do you translate that to the page and represent that dynamic? It's really challenging. And so it took a lot of experimentation and figuring out how to do it. And then just doing it at the level of like one scene, and then but also doing it at the level of multiple scenes, right? And then flipping back and forth between time and memory and place and how everything kind of ties together. That took a lot of time, I guess, for me to be able to kind of figure that out. I think reading a couple like specific books and a couple specific authors kind of helped me. So I mean, reading Marilyn Dumont's poetry in the Pemmican Eaters, which just to get a bit academic-y, like I argue it's like this rhizomatic exploration of the contexts of the Northwest Resistance without actually narrating like the battles themselves. It's like it gives you a sense of the place and the culture. But it does that same sort of flipping back and forth between time a little bit, right? And place. And so I was like, oh, this is really interesting in how this is working in poetry. And how can I perhaps try to do this in fiction? And then reading Joshua Whitehead's novel, Johnny Appleseed, I think, right? He plays with memory in a really interesting way in that novel. And so that too is like, oh, okay, so this is how I can incorporate memory with history and all these things. And so just drawing on like all these different authors. And then Louise Erdrich, some of her novels set around like the Turtle Mountain area, and some of the novels that kind of explore the Red River Valley as well. It's like, oh, seeing the Red River Valley kind of represented in fiction was like really interesting. And so just drawing on all of these things and putting it together was a little bit part of my process, I guess.
It was really effective. I think the standout for me was when Richard is downtown and becomes disoriented and the city kind of crumbles into the past. And reading it, and I read it a few times being like, how is he doing this? Like it was, I don't think I've had the pleasure of being, experiencing what the character is experiencing, not just visually and emotionally, but kind of beyond those emotions, the confusion and having to sort out what is going on here. I'm reading from the outside. It was really kind of incredible. It was a joy to read.
Mhm. Thank you. Yeah, that scene was something that I had in mind when I first started, I guess, the revision. So probably after year 3 of the PhD, you get the coursework and a lot of the reading done out of the way. I'm midway through the dissertation, and then I'm tired of writing the dissertation. Now I'm going to go back to writing fiction. And then I was like, I had this idea now that I wanted to, create that confluence of time and space where there is already the confluence of the rivers and everything, right? So like everything is just like crescendos and comes together in this big moment where everything, all of history is kind of laid out in one place and one time, right? To try to do that anyways. And not do it in like a sort of didactic kind of way either, right? To try to make it feel kind of organic and feel natural. So that was the challenge. I mean, I rewrote and revised that scene a bunch. There's the part where the cathedral is kind of burning. So at first that was like a longer section at the beginning of the chapter, but then that felt too much like a historical lesson, like a history lesson at that point. So it was like learning to like pull back on the history and just gesture toward it and not just insert the whole thing like a block quote, right? To like work around how to do that and how to weave in these moments so that it feels natural. It feels like it's Richard himself who's experiencing it. and not the author inserting like a history lesson, right? So that's the challenge of doing that. Glad it worked.
Thank you. Nadya, I know we have a little bit more time and we've got some questions and comments here in the chat. Maybe I'll throw it over to you.
Yes, we have a couple questions in the chat, and Rebecca, maybe that was more of your questions about the writing process, but if you have more, like completely dive in. So we have a question. I think some of these were sorry, I think some of these were somewhat mentioned or touched on briefly, about your research about the dirt taken from the St. Boniface Cemetery or the headstones. I think that's perhaps what that reader was touching on. And then just another comment about the language in the novel, about how the language is how many Francophone and Métis families speak. The other question that stands out is why not use more old names? And my high school French is rusty too. So like Ville and Pocho Livre for more color. Does this translate well enough, or maybe someone who has more better with accents can reread for me?
Can you hear me?
Oh yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Is my video frozen?
Your video is frozen, Matt.
Okay.
What happened?
I don't know what's going on, but as long as you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so yeah, there was some like the Pocho Lièvre would be Saint-Geneviève, Thibauville would be Richer. Like there's others in there, like La Brise Culotte, I think, is like La Broquerie. So it's trying to strike that balance, I guess, right? Like how much to use, because the risk with like so much French is that you do risk disorienting the reader, and so that's something that I'm conscious of. Like I was talking about that, making that challenging people to meet me halfway, but I don't want to make the challenge so difficult that they don't meet me halfway. So that is something that's always back of my mind, though, is how else, what I don't include in this novel, where can I include in the future, right? Like I don't think that I'm done writing, and so these are things that I want to include as well. I mean, I included some like La Ligne Fauché. Like I think very few people will know where that is. I think it's like Municipal Road 40 East or something is called La Ligne Fauché. Yeah, I don't know. One thing I will mention is there's we're doing a French translation of the book, so it's being whoa.
Did he cut out for everyone else?
The audio caught up with the video there, yeah.
Yeah. Matthew, come back.
Maybe Matt, if you can sign out and sign back in.
Yeah, Matthew, if you can hear us, sign out and sign back in, maybe. Oh
wow.
Here we are. These are the joys of doing a live stream, right? We never know what's gonna happen.
There we go. Okay, so I'm on my phone now.
Oh, of course, on your phone. Perfect. Great.
Thank you, Del.
You didn't have a manuscript open, or
we'll figure that out tomorrow. So what was I saying before the whole thing?
You're doing a French translation.
Yes, yeah. So the doing a French translation with a publisher in Quebec, and so it's going to be really interesting to try to capture the same vibe, right? That sort of bilingual, trilingual, multilingual aspect of it across languages. But I think the opportunity with doing a version, it's kind of like I was describing it to, I think, to Adam and some people the other day as like a photo negative in a sense, right? Where we flip the English to French, and then kind of the English stays in like the dialogue. Is the opportunity to actually put more of perhaps place names as something that I'll run by the translator, but also put more Frenchmanship and then use more Frenchmanship spelling as well. And so really push the, I guess, push the ability to try to, recapture some of that language as well. So that's a kind of an exciting possibility to see where it goes. So in the sense, like this version of the novel is done. It's out there in the world, but there's like another version of it coming out there. And so I'm curious to see what we can do with that version, while keeping it true in the sense to this one.
I think that's very good. And I will say, although my high school French is spotty, I will say that I found the context, as you already touched on, was more than enough for myself to understand what was going on throughout the novel. And so a compliment. I think you did a wonderful job mixing the two and cushioning it so that the reader is following. Oh yeah, I remember that verb tense. And so I can understand what's going on, but the rest of the storyline really shows me more. So thank you for that, and apologies for my rusty pronunciation.
No worries.
I will say we got one more comment via email from another reader who said that they lived and worked for many years in Montreal. They really enjoyed the French language parts and felt the view of those living in small town to be enriching. And they really enjoyed the deeper look at what their lives were like. So thank you to the reader for submitting that email. We have one more that's dropped in, or two more that's dropped in the chat, so we'll try and squeeze them in. We're wrapping up here soon. Your exploration of Métis identity, hidden and emerging with trepidation. How is this linked to your own story, and where did you want to push us as readers?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, growing up, it's not something we talked about too much. I mean, my dad told us that we were Michif, and I'm Michif through my mom's side. From her side, we're descended from the Hogue family that lived in St. Charles Parish during the Red River settlement time, kind of thing. It's not something that we really knew about, and so there's that kind of process of genealogical connection and learning about where you're from, which is one aspect of reconnecting. But then as I've come to see through the years as well, is sometimes maybe reconnection is not quite even the right word, because it's also a recognition of what part of the culture is still alive, what's still present, and that you're still living, right? And then perhaps some families, the signifier, or like the attachment to the word Métis has perhaps dropped away over the generations, but then they're still living the culture. And so what does it mean to reconnect when you're still living the culture, but you just haven't identified as Métis? And so it's at that point, it's recognizing yourself as still living that culture, and then maybe just reconnecting to a broader community, right? So it's a complicated journey. I think, I don't want to speak for everyone in my family, but people are going through their journeys in different ways and understanding and how they're reconnecting, learning about history and whatnot. And my way has been through writing a lot, and then meeting people, talking to people, reading and writing, and then just kind of situating myself right in like the broader story and recognizing the diversity within the Métis Nation, right? So, the Francophone Red River experience here versus living in Alberta for 7 years doing my PhD, and just realizing the experience of Cree Métis people living there, and then like the Métis settlements in Alberta, and just becoming more aware of the different Michif languages as well. So what I'm, trying to do with my book is bring back a little bit of the French Michif, but knowing that there's Southern or Heritage Michif as well, right, which is more French and Cree, and then Northern Michif, which is more Cree heavy. And so just recognizing all this and learning about it over time, it's all part of that journey, and just like recognizing and reconnecting and whatnot. So I've lost track of what the original question was at this point.
I think you answered it. And I'll say last one from our readers who are watching online with us. It sounds like we have one reader who's maybe excited, looking forward to reading this book. they were wondering about the timelines of the story and what you would ultimately like readers to take away from it. I was kind of chuckling to myself when I was trying to also place in my mind, oh, what year would this take place in? Like thinking about the technology that's used and Richard's driving a Buick. I drive a Buick. I drive an F5 Buick. I'm like, this could be present day, So
Yeah.
over to you.
Timelines 2007, I think, is when the narrative set. So the biggest clue is the cell phone model of the father. He has a Razor cell phone, which was very popular in 2007. Otherwise, the historical periods that go back, I mean, he goes back to his childhood. But the flood of 97 is kind of a big subplot in the sense, right? In his memories, and then further historical periods as well from there, kind of flits around through memory and story and whatnot. But the contemporary narrative is 2007-ish. Yeah, and then as far as takeaways, storytelling, I think, is like the big takeaway, right? How storytelling works, how storytelling keeps people alive, how storytelling keeps peoples alive as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Rebecca, Adam, do you have any last burning questions that you want to ask Matt before we say our sign-offs?
I was just curious about a couple tough scenes with animals, the turtle and the dog, and sort of the more general kind of threat of encroachment and what is habitat and what happens to us when our habitat is changed or when we are properly in someone else's, and those themes that run through it, and the brutality that only sometimes visits the humans really seems to impact a few of the poor animals more greatly. And then the creeping kind of dread of death of a loved one and a dread of flood. And there's just these stakes that keep creeping throughout the story. And are these all things that you're pouring in and weaving and meshing and layering like an engineer? Are some of them ones that come to you and you draw them in like kind of closer because they happen automatically or naturally for you? I'm curious how much is felt and how much is built?
That's a great question. So part of it is built in the sense that it's part of the representation of rural life. Dealing with skunks, dealing with animals in that way. Realities of farm life kind of thing, that they inform the way that sometimes animals are treated. I think, thinking back on it too, thematically, you could argue that it's broken relationships between the human and the other than human as well, right? It's kind of representative of, brokenness between people and the non-human world. How much of that I was consciously thinking about and how much of that was perhaps feeling, I couldn't say. The one scene in particular that stands out because it was like one of the last ones that I wrote was the turtle scene. The turtle scene was like one of the last things that I wrote. And there was that chapter where I think that happens in like the fishing chapter, like he's in the hardware store, right? And so it flits back to like the turtle story. That the turtle story wasn't there for, the first 6 years of the existence of this novel. And then I just felt that there was something missing. And so that was a feeling. I felt that there was something missing here. And so I just started thinking about, so that's a little bit of personal experience. When we were first living in the town of St. Anne, we were like kind of on the edge of town, and we were like on like a little river lot right by the Seine River. And so like I grew up next to the Seine River before we ended up moving outside of town between St. Anne and Richer. And so I wanted to kind of like explore the Seine a little bit. It's a bit of a callback to some other short stories that I've written. But then I started writing about this turtle for some reason. I don't know why. And then it grew from there. And then it grew into the scene where, Monday destroys the turtle, right? Then the turtle can be very representative of, Turtle Island kind of thing, right? And so um what the scene ultimately means, I mean, it's not for me to say. I think I like to perhaps leave that because I don't know 100% myself either. It is feeling in terms of that scene, and I think readers can draw a lot out of that scene. Yeah, so I think it's going in knowing that I want it to represent a certain level of things, but then seeing at that point how do you just make sure that it feels right and round it off with that feeling to make sure that it really captures something.
Aside from the translation of this novel into French, what is the next project, Matt?
I'm working on a Métis literary Western horror novel set in like 1830s North Dakota. So something that I've come across in reading Métis literature is that we have less focus on the United States. We tend to center Métis stuff in Canada, but there are Métis people in the United States. That's part of the homeland there, northern North Dakota and Montana, and so I wanted to try to explore some of those stories from south of the Medicine Line, right? And then I'm kind of writing it in like a Cormac McCarthy style right now, so it's very dark and foreboding. We'll see how that transforms over the years. I'm hoping it doesn't take 7 years, but we'll see.
Great, thank you so much. I think our time is running out here, so I'll do our little final goodbyes. Thank you all so much for this amazing discussion, and thank you to everyone who submitted so many questions on the live chat. That was just fantastic. Next month, we will be welcoming not one, but two authors to our book club for Valley of the Bird Tail. Our next meeting will take place right here on our YouTube channel on March 26th. Our meeting will feature authors Andrew Stowo-Snyderman and Douglas Sanderson, along with Free Press Arts and Life editor Jill Wilson, and of course, our friends from McNally Robinson. We appreciate everyone who's tuned in with us tonight, and thank you so much for reading along, and we'll see you next month.